symbolic value to a deeper meaning, something that's going on within inside of us that we have difficulty expressing in words. That's particularly true at a time like the death of a loved one, where it's difficult to find the words to express what's really happening inside of us. And so engaging in a ritual, a candle lighting, for example, or many of the other sorts of activities that we engage in during the funeral events, help give expression to what's going on inside of us as grievers or bereaved people.
Bob was just talking about the definition of ceremony and ritual, and I'd like to just address ceremony and ritual in funeral events. Why is that important, and how do we put ritual in funeral events? When we have a funeral, it marks that the death was special. This is not an ordinary event. After all, people only die once, and it is one of the most important events, I think, that we can get together and have some service about. We celebrate decade birthdays and retirements, but the end of a person's life and spanning their life is so important. It also has a way of expressing things that are very difficult to talk about because they're such intense, deep emotional feelings. When words are inadequate, a lot of grief educators have said, have a ritual. And that is so true. Some things are hard to put in words, and we can act them out in a form of a ritual. It also provides a lot of structure for the grieving people at the time when they're pretty disoriented and experiencing some shock and numbness and saying, well, what do we do now? It really does help to be able to have some ritual, to have some funeral events that structure that for them, that do speak to how important this event, the death of a loved one, was in their life. It also gives people permission to grieve in a multitude of ways by many factions of funeral events that actually trigger emotion. And that's a very healthy thing to have happen in funeral setting. It does connect the community as well with those that are bereaved. It gives the community a chance to also grieve this person in their community who died, but it also helps the bereaved to begin to feel comforted and supported, like there are people who really care about me. It also helps the reality to say this person died and isn't in the present anymore. I can't expect to live life with this person, and now I have to translate all of the life that I had with that person to memory. So it is an excellent way to begin the grief journey, and there's research to support that people who have funeral events really begin a grief journey in a far healthier way than people who don't.
The classic series of funeral events is pretty well known to many of us. They're rather traditional. They consist of like a visitation and then the service itself, probably a committal service with a luncheon following it. And we want to look at these various elements just for a few moments to see how they really support that deeper meaning that comes from ritual and tradition. For example, the visitation is very important. We're talking here about the 2 to 4, 7 to 9 gathering of people in the funeral home or in the church, where family and friends in the community come together to support and be together with the bereaved. It's the kind of place where you may hear stories that you hadn't heard before, some memories that the family might not be aware of that people have going to share with them. It may be the time where you get support. You acknowledge the closure of life. You denote the person's worth because all of these people have taken time out of their very busy schedule to come to pay their last respects, to offer their condolences. But what it also does is it does say to the family and to the bereaved person that this person was not just an individual in the family or in a relationship to that other individual, but this acknowledges that the community has lost an important person as well. And so the ritual or the tradition of having the visitation is very, very powerful. We said to one person just the other day who asked about what's the purpose of that and how do I say things to somebody at a visitation, we responded simply saying showing up is the most important thing. Being there as a representative of the community to acknowledge that this person was an important part of that community.
Bob was just talking with us about visitation, and that is one opportunity that people can have a viewing. They can have an open casket and be able to come and actually see the person deceased. Another opportunity is actually at the time of death, wherever it occurred. But it is an opportunity that is very helpful for people when it's possible. You know, realizing that there are some extenuating circumstances where it's not. But when it is, we would really recommend that people do consider really seriously having a viewing, because it is true that the adage, seeing is believing, does help grieving people. There's already this disbelief that occurs when somebody dies, and when a person has actually viewed the body, it does help us begin to accept the reality better than if there was no viewing. There are some myths associated with seeing the body. One is that the people who view the body will only remember that person deceased and not alive and vibrant. That's so untrue, because our brains are very intricate. We remember a whole slideshow of all of our life with whoever it is that was deceased. Grieving people also very much want to see that body once more and remember every single detail and want to touch the person again. Seeing a body also triggers very much emotion, which is a healthy thing in a safe environment like a funeral event is. And it gives time for somebody to concretely say goodbye to their deceased. I'd just like to say a word about children and viewing bodies. From a psych perspective, it most often is a very helpful thing for kids because they have such vivid imaginations that most often they imagine a person's body looking far worse than what it is. And so to see it is really helpful for them. And we know psychologically that when somebody has a direct cremation and really avoids any kind of funeral event or also a viewing, that really prolongs grief and sometimes causes people to be stuck in grief, because having funeral events and seeing a body when it's possible really help a person on the journey to accepting the reality of that person's death.
As Susan is saying, viewing of a body is an extremely important aspect of the funeral events, but there are some religious and cultural communities where that type of activity is not supported. In the Jewish faith, for example, funeral services are usually held very soon after the death because the body is not embalmed, and therefore they don't have a viewing of the body very often. It's seldom displayed, and so people are going to have to make some accommodation, some adjustment, perhaps seeing the body in the first place, as Susan was saying, at the home or at the time of death. It's simply to note that this is a very good challenge, a very real challenge for people when it's not able to be seen and when the body isn't there. The next thing that really comes in the classic funeral service following the visitation and perhaps the viewing of the body is the service itself. We want to underscore the fact that the funeral service really serves two functions, two purposes. The one, of course, is to celebrate the life of the deceased, to honor that person, to recall that person's values, accomplishments, interests, to talk realistically about the person, maybe even some of the foibles and some of the funny little times of that person. But the other aspect of it is to also recognize that the people who have gathered, particularly the family, but friends and other extended family members, are also grieving. There's deep sadness, deep grief that goes on, and it's a very public ceremony in which they can say goodbye to this deceased person. It also provides a spiritual connection, perhaps with others and with their sense of God and their religion, because death really forces us to think about an afterlife if we believe in that, but it is a metaphysical or at least a spiritual component of what's going on in the people's lives.
I'd like to talk about burial and the disposition of the body, but want you to all be aware that this isn't necessarily in the sequence that they occur. People sometimes have burials before they actually have the funeral service or the memorial, and sometimes they have them after a social gathering that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But this burial or the placing of the body in its final resting place is probably for grieving people the most difficult, because there is that final finality where they're not going to be able to see this person or the casket, the urn with the cremains again. And people that are grieving do know that. But we really think there's some value in going to the site of where this body is going to be placed, because it really does help people again accept that reality that that person is dead, and I now have to say goodbye to that person and leave that person at that site. It definitely reinforces the finality of that death. And it also provides a place for people to return to remember. And some people feel very connected with the final resting place of their deceased. And they will want to visit and go and talk with that person. They feel comforted there for quite a while after the death.
Another aspect of a classic funeral simply is the luncheon. A lot of us in our culture know that when we gather around food, it's a signal of intimacy, of friendship. We have people in for dinner that we want to be close to. Well, similarly, at the time of the death of a loved one, typically a funeral event has a social time following, or at least involved in this sequence of events, where people gather around a light lunch or some food, perhaps even it's just a little hors d'oeuvres. But the important part of this is that people now can signal the fact that they've made it through that service. You can almost hear a sort of corporate sigh of relief as they come in for the luncheon, and they know that that difficult part is now over. And what happens so often is you hear people starting to tell stories about the deceased or sharing pictures. There may even be some laughter at such a difficult time as the death of a loved one, because they're starting to let down, they're starting to realize that something's going to happen here, that they need to be closer now to the family and to the deceased person. But what also happens, and I think this is probably one of the most important parts of this social time, is that they begin to surround the bereaved person or the bereaved family to really find out now what it is that they might be able to do in order to be supportive of them while they're on their grief journey.
We've just talked about all of the components of funeral events, but we want you to know that we haven't done them in any necessary order, because that really can be individual family preference of how they want to space things and what order they want to put things. But one of the things that we want to say from a psych perspective is that psychologically it is very healthy if people can take a little time between events. Now, we realize in today's culture and busy world that sometimes that isn't possible for people. But the more that there can be some time in between events, like having the visitation one day and having the funeral service the next, with perhaps the luncheon and then the burial maybe even the next day, that would probably be very ideal, because it gives people the opportunity to digest each one of these events. If you can use the analogy of going to a restaurant and ordering a 5-course meal and having the waiter bring all the courses at once, it really does make it difficult to appreciate and to really understand and taste what actually has been given to you. Same way with funeral events, that grieving people will say a lot of the funeral events were kind of a blur, that they remember just bits and pieces of them. But if they're spaced, if it's possible to space them, we'd say that would be a good idea, because it gives the grievers a chance to just talk about it together, to really reflect on it, to express some emotions, and to really have the anticipation of, now I'm going to go and do this event. And it does help with that grief journey. We've been talking a lot about the grief journey, and maybe you don't even really understand what exactly we mean, because we're talking about that period of time, and there isn't really a timed event, a time period with that grief journey, other than we really believe it takes a minimum of a year, because people have to go through all of the firsts. But there is a defined journey after somebody dies where they are grieving that person's death and trying to figure out some things about their own self. And on that grief journey,